Is that? Hang on. I think we're having audio problems. Yeah, we're having.
Are we good now? I can't hear anything. Hello? Because I can't hear anything. Hey, can you hear this? Can you hear this? Hang on. Thankfully, we don't have anyone in the so far. Let me get this fixed sorted first. I think we're sorted, actually. Let me just check. Audio, yes. No. What the actual hell is going on? Hang on. I, it's working. It was working this whole time. I had the volume on low. I'm live. I'm send it to. So first, before I want to get started, I want to give a shout to a special somebody who recently subscribed to my channel. All right. Let's see here. So recently as say, my friend Clone Trooper 117 subscribe. Go give him a shout out, people. Well, when you're at it. But without further ado, I think we should get started on today. So we are covering Ghost, Windsor Castle, and let's let's see. How do I put a poll up? Let's see. Shoot. Analytics. All right, analytics. Had a paranormal XP. All right, our poll is up and running. And without further ado, let us actually get to it. And so we're talking about Windsor Castle, which let me actually pull up because I had a schematic. Schematic. How the heck? All right, here. So this is Windsor. It's in Windsor, the UK, which I think is London. It's named after the royal family, which technically they're only Windsor in name. Technically, there's not Windsor because the British royal family aren't even British. They're and Neat Cat Media, welcome in. So this is just keep this in mind. The Henry III, Ed Third Tower. Let's see the library. The library. This is actually where we'll be recording our first. And here's Great Castles. I just found this, and this was a story I had heard the other day. And so it says Windsor Castle is located in the tranquil town of Windsor in Berkshire, England, just west of London. Built during the decade following the Norman conquest of England in 1066, it is the oldest and largest inhabited castle in Europe. So that's some fun facts. So you could see why this is haunted. And the abbot has been home to British royalty for centuries, including its current monarch, King Charles III. However, he is one of many royal figures of England to walk its halls still, as you will soon see. And let's get this. Let's see, because all right. So, as Richard tells the story, in February 1897, Lieutenant Carl Geehan of the Grenadier Guard. So this is I can already tell by this guy is a Welsh of the Welsh Grenadier Guard. Uh, let's see. Cards. Was sitting in the outer room of the Queen's Library when a lady dressed in black walked past him and turned a corner. Intrigued by the woman's resemblance to the portraits he had seen of Elizabeth I, Gillian followed but could find no trace of her. Furthermore, there was no doorway through which she could have left the library. He asked an attendant who the lady was, but was told he was the only person who had entered the library that afternoon. The attendant then raised the possibility that the lieutenant had been armed with a special sighting of Queen Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I is not the only royal to undertake ghostly premonition, premonition, yeah, I can't speak, premonitions around the corridors of and grounds of Windsor Castle for apparitions of both Henry VIII and Charles I have been seen here. Just before Christmas 1848, Charles Stuart, who was taken prisoner to Windsor Castle following the decade decision should be that he should be prosecuted for his life as a criminal person. Following his trial and beheading in London on January 30th, 1649, his body was returned to Windsor to be buried at the same spot as Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. As the black draped coffin was carried toward St. George's Chapel, the sky, which until then had been cern, since certain and clear. I've never seen this cloud over and a sudden blizzard swept across the grounds. The black pall over the coffin was all white by the time the funeral carriage reached the end of the chapel, and many took this as a divine sign the kind proclaimed the king's innocence. God. Hey, Golden Age Geek is here. Welcome. Give a shout to Golden Age Geek actually. He he couldn't attend today, but he's here in the chat. So let's see. As a sick older man, George III spent much of his time at Windsor, and each day would take and return the afternoon salutes of his guard. Following his death, while his body lay in state, the guards were passing the king's window when the commanding officer saw the unmistakable figure of the king standing in his customary place. Instinctively gave your eyes right, and as they swung around, each of the soldiers saw the figure and watched as he returned their salute. In April 1906, a sentry was on duty one night at the top of the pathway beyond the main entrance to the castle when a group of men appeared from nowhere and began walking toward them. Thinking they were intruders, the sentry challenged them, but they continued to advance. When they ignored his third challenge, he cocked his rifle and fired at the leading figure, which paused momentarily but continued forward. Raising his bayonet, the soldier charged at the group, whereupon they preemptly vanished into thin air. He reported the experience to his commanding officer, and a full-scale search of the castle grounds was undertaken. No intruders were found, and the sentry was confined to barracks for 3 days as punishment. Um, the view of the castle's south face from the long walk in Windsor Grey Park is stunning, although at night it can be sinister. Here in 1927, that an 18-year-old guardsman patrolling this area was overcome with mel- melo- melancholy. I, I cannot pronounce it. I guess he was overcome with grief and why do you put all these? Just say that he was overcome with grief or fear and Sean self. Weeks later, a colleague of his, Sergeant Leek, was given the same duty. At the end of his shift, he was pleased to hear the footsteps of what he presumed to be Leek. Instead, he found himself gazing at the face of the young suicide. As he stared in astonishment, his relief marched into view and the apparition vanished. Back at the barracks, he reported the experience to several other sentries who all claimed to have witnessed the manifestation of their dead associate. Wow, that's pretty crazy. And I just the brief poll I have finished up, and the nose had it. And speaking of Golden Age, Jake, I'm not sure if he wants me to share this, but if he's still here, I will gladly share it because this is a pretty interesting story, and I could share some of my own personal experiences in the brief time. Let's see. Hmm, there's a video that I want. So, Windsor Castle Ghosts. Let's see. Yes, it was this video. I'm not. So this is when we get there. I'll share it, but we'll be reacting. So this is from Golden Age Geek, and go follow him, and also go follow Need Cat Media, who's in the chat right now. Go follow him, and they're phenomenal people. Um, so he wrote in response to this poll, "Forget about believing. I know that they do exist. Countless members of my family have seen this old man who sometimes appears at one of my windows of my grandpa's house. These family members range from the age of 6 to 50, and each describes the same individual with the same clothes. After their initial encounters, and after they have run into a room and told everyone else, other members of the family verify this by asking them to describe what they have seen, and every time it is the same description. I remember when my 6-year-old cousin came running in asking who it was at the window, as he had never seen this man before. And when we asked him to describe who he saw, the same description again. And when my parents and grandparents showed me photos, I leaned I learned that it was my great great granddad who passed away many years ago that everyone sees. Not many of us actually got the chance to meet him. I certainly didn't, but nevertheless, that is who the man is. I can attest to that. When so I'm not sure if I've told this story to some people, but when I was like 2 or 3, I was really into Thomas trains, as most kids my age would be, and I would carry them everywhere. And so one morning, I'm going into my parents' room at my old house. So this is the layout of my old house. Was my parents' room was just imagine my parents' room was right here, and so there's a hallway you go and down there in this, and I guess to the left down this hall. So down the hallway and to the left, as Donald Trump would say, would be my bedroom. And I mean, I forgot. Maybe it was in my, because I don't remember. Because I remember my old bedroom was where we had refurbished. We ended up refurbishing for a laundry room. Um, I remember waking up one morning, and I did not have a train. I just ran to my mom's room, and I went to bed. And actually, I could have been like 4. I mean, I don't remember. It all blends together because actually before even that, my bedroom was in what my was my sister's room. But getting sidetracked here, I went down the hall to so I left my parents' bedroom that morning. I went down the hallway and into my mom's room. I fell back asleep, and I woke up sometime shortly, and I see this white figure, and just beautiful, a female. She was in like a wedding dress, and she handed me one of Thomas, my toy Thomas train. I forgot which one. I don't really care to acknowledge because that's not important. What's important is she handed me, and I remember she looked translucent. I remember that. and she quickly ends up hands it, leaves, and I go back to sleep and I wake up later from what I guess I had thought was a dream, but somehow I ended up having the train and I did not know how I got it. That's one of many stories. I could share some others, but we don't have time. Let's actually react to this video, which is got some stories about encounters with the ghost of Henry VIII, playing this ad play, a double ad. It's a double ad. You know, I dread the day when we get triple ads. I dread that day when we get triple ads on YouTube. And this channel is Ghost Casebook, which I'm now subscribed to. Go subscribe to them. I'm not sponsored. I don't have anything to do with them. I just go and I've got also watched. I think I actually did watch that. I think Edward the Eighth. So you can see this. This is kind of the schematic. And Golden Age Geek actually has been the Windsor Castle, which he was. I'm not sure if he's in chat, so but if he was, I could just he could definitely tell me more about the how it's structured, like the inside, because we can see the outside. The inside is, I've heard it's massive.
Windsor Castle is the oldest and largest inhabited castle in Europe. Construction began under William the Conqueror in the 11th century, and since that time to the present day, it serves as the residence of the reigning monarch. Windsor Castle is final resting place for many kings, queens, and members of the royal family, including the late Queen Elizabeth II and her husband, Prince Philip. Known for its history and beautiful architecture, it's been the scene of many a royal birth and death. Could this be why Windsor Castle is reputedly so?
You know, I'm interested to see if anyone, although Elizabeth II didn't die in Windsor Castle, she died in one of the castles up in Scotland.
Haunted.
So this is on Henry VIII, who I don't need to say much about. If you know who about him, I, you know what I get done with this video or maybe this part, I gotta play a queso clip where somebody tells him he looked like Henry VIII. It was the funniest stuff ever, but back on track.
One of the most famous ghost sightings at Windsor is the apparition of Henry VIII. Famous for his fiery temper, numerous wives, beheadings, and enormous stature, the Tudor king has been seen walking hallways and cloisters near the deanery. Ghostly groans, shouts, and the sounds of footsteps have been heard in the hallway, accompanied by a dragging sound, like someone dragging a lame, ulcerated leg.
Honestly, what would you do if you saw the ghost of Henry VIII? Like, what would you do?
His angry spirit is heard shouting orders to non-existent staff, along with cries of pain and suffering. In 1977, two soldiers keeping guard on the battlements watched in astonishment as they saw the easily recognized spirit disappear into a solid wall. Buried with his wife Jane Seymour in a vault at St. George's Chapel, his tortured screams suggest that his earthbound spirit is trapped in the castle, reliving the pain he lived with and inflicted on others for eternity. Anne Boleyn is also said to haunt at Windsor, as well as the Tower of London, Hever Castle, and Blickling Hall, her place of birth. Observed at the window of the Dean's Cloister, her melancholy gaze and pale, dismal face have startled many visitors and staff alike. Anne Boleyn's marriage to Henry VIII changed the course of British history forever. After she failed to give Henry a male heir, Henry made the brutal decision to execute her. Accused of adultery, incest, and high treason, Anne Boleyn was condemned to death and executed by beheading at the Tower of London on the 19th of May, 1536.
Brutal.
Could it be that her tragic, untimely, and barbaric death has caused her sorrowful, restless soul to haunt not just the Dean's Cloister, but also the eastern parapet and grounds of Windsor Castle, where the headless apparition of Anne Boleyn has apparently been witnessed?
Yes, I've heard this many times before that allegedly a lot of the ghosts that you can see are headless ghosts. The angry little boy.
So many rooms at Windsor Castle have haunting tales connected with them. One of the bedrooms located in the deanery is reputedly haunted by the spirit of an angry little boy. He apparently shouts out, "I don't want to go riding today," before suddenly vanishing. Could this be a young Edward III or Henry VI, both born at Windsor Castle centuries ago, reliving a childhood tantrum?
That usually that could actually happen. There's lots of times where tragedy, if someone dies in a tragic way, spirits don't pass on to the afterlife, is what the theory is, and you can see this at a lot of battlefields. Obviously, one of the famous ones here in America, in North America, is Gettysburg, which is one of the bloodiest battles on the North American continent. Um, I know that a lot. There's this one place in Belgium. It's a World War I battlefield that's allegedly haunted by an entire Welsh regiment that got slaughtered charging into a German position in the forest, and a lot of people still hear their scream. It's very interesting. And and as we get on with the end of this, there's actually some other famous ghosts. One very famous ghost close to me.
Royal biographer Hector Bolitho lived at the deanery and witnessed ghostly footsteps. He reported, "I used to hear them at night, walking quickly past my bedroom door. Oddly, there were only 3 steps, but the unseen ghost seemed to take 4 steps down before resuming his hurried pace. But later I discovered that the flooring in this part of the old house had been raised from its earlier level, and in the process 1 step had been eliminated. In addition to the deanery, the stairway of the Mary Tudor Tower is the location of ghostly footsteps, frequently heard by visitors of the 1 step in this part of the old house. In addition to the deanery, the stairway of the Mary Tudor Tower is the location of ghostly footsteps.
And if I'm gonna let me see, share this instead. So the Mary Tudor. So this is the Henry VIII Gateway. Where's the Mary? Huh. There's Curfew Tower. So I'm trying to figure out which area this, because that's what they said. They said Mary Tudor Tower, right? I'm not going. Yeah. Hmm. And Golden Age. Yep. He put this just to answer your question from earlier. Is in fact a gigantic on the inside. Just imagine a typical royal house. Everything feels like it has come from a fantasy movie. Gold and red everywhere, and it's been kept in really good maintenance. This is probably why the British castles are probably the most popular. Other than the British royal family is pretty much the most well-known royal family in the world. I mean, come on, you can't go anywhere without hearing their name. The Windsors or the Saxe Colbert Goths, as they really are. But for this sake, we'll just call them Windsors because that's what they've been called for 100 years. And you know what? And Twitter, they've got that new dead naming. Well, so we're not going to dead name the Windsors, okay? We're not dead naming them.
frequently heard by visitors and guests staying in the bedroom at the top of the tower.
All right. So this part is the library, the Royal Library.
In
I've
addition
gone
to King
over
Henry
this.
VIII, another persistent royal apparition is that of Queen Elizabeth I, who seems to have made the Royal Library her favourite haunt.
Yes,
The library is not open to the public, but accounts of her haunting have been witnessed by members of the royal family. King George III apparently saw the apparition.
A few years ago, I got to see a play of A Christmas Carol in the main halls. That sounds awesome. Okay, it was magic. That sounds awesome. That's something. If I ever go Bryn, which I will most certainly at some point before my life comes to an end, I will most certainly someday go to Bryn. I've got to go try that out once. I gotta do that once. There's like Bryn has so many good places to go to. It's so crazy. All right.
Who declared to him that she was married to England, and Queen Victoria's son, Edward VII, that King George III apparently saw the apparition, who declared to him that she was married to England, and Queen Victoria's son, Edward VII, also told one of his many mistresses that he had a similar encounter.
That's that's not something usually you'd bring up to your mistress, but what do I know?
Footsteps are often heard traversing the library before she appears, gliding into another room. She appears dressed in black, with a long black shawl draped over her shoulders. In 1897, during Queen Victoria's
This is the story I told earlier.
Diamond Jubilee, Lieutenant Carl Glynn of the Grenadier Guards had the opportunity to visit the library and settled himself into a chair on the east side of the library, quietly reading the history of Dorsetshire. Unexpectedly, he became aware of the sound of heels on the wooden boards walking through the inner library. Looking up from his book, he saw a female figure dressed in black with a black lace shawl on her head and shoulders pass him by and turn sharply into a bay. Shortly after this encounter, at 4 o'clock, Lieutenant Glynn asked the library attendant who the lady was at work in the inner library. The attendant explained that Glynn was in fact the only visitor to the library that afternoon. Glynn protested that he had just seen the figure walk into the inner room, so the attendant went to check. She found no one.
Recommendations of places you should visit when you come here. I would recommend checking out the National Mirror Museum at Bellevue and Portsmouth Bay. I love those places. I'll check them out, actually. I will 100% check them out. There's a lot of places that I will be checking out. Obviously, lots of my family came from England. And then, yeah, that's pretty cool.
Glynn was adamant that she must have walked out of a door in the corner and gestured to the bay where he saw the lady in black.
Yeah.
The librarian insisted that there wasn't a door
And I think they are mentioned this or haven't yet mentioned this, but the library, it's no longer on access to the public, I don't think. And I know that the royals, because they still use Windsor Castle to an extent, they like to use it.
For anybody to use. But she did explain that many years ago, a door did indeed stand in the same location. The chief librarian, Dr. Holmes, sent for Glynn to ask him for a description of the figure he had seen. Once Holmes had the details, he exclaimed, "It is the same. You have seen the apparition of Queen Elizabeth I."
Learn Italian with real Italian TV.
Yeah, it's probably because I'm learning Italian.
Empress Frederick, who also saw the same figure in the same place as a young child. The encounter made it into the newspapers in 1897.
This reminds me because in the White House there was a policy. There's actually some policy actually until I forgot when actually, but because of the amount of ghost sightings, and I think it began in the Taft administration. This policy because in the both the Roosevelt and the Taft administration there was when the ghost sightings in the White House started, and they continue. And I think in the 50s or 60s was when stuff started to get leaked to the public. Actually, I could go into that next week, ghost sightings in the White House, because, or if I have time here, I might just do that, go into a couple of sightings, because several, just like several British monarchs have seen ghosts in many of these castles, several very important U.S. presidents and members of Congress and the of members of both the House and Senate have had paranormal encounters.
With Mrs. Sidney Carr Glynn giving an interview to a somewhat sceptical reporter. A more modern encounter with the ghost of Queen Elizabeth I occurred in the early 20th century. Edward VII declared that he had seen her, as well as King George VI, father of Queen Elizabeth II and Princess Margaret. He apparently saw the apparition on 8 consecutive nights in the same location at the start of World War II. Could she appear as a warning or a crisis apparition?
This is not the first time. Back to the U.S., there's usually a black cat that appears in the White House before tragedy. Last time it appeared, I think, was actually before the assassination of President Kennedy. So back in the 60s. And then in Rush, there's the ghost of the architect who was an Italian, I think a Genoese architect who, once he had finished constructing it, the Russians had imprisoned him because they didn't want him to reveal any secrets. And apparently his ghost has appeared before national tragedy. I think it appeared, one of its most famous appearing was to actually none other than Joseph Stalin himself before the Germans invaded in 1941. So that's something to keep in mind, is that a lot of times these paranormal appearances happen before tragedy. Like I think that Black Cat also may have appeared to several White House aides the day before Pearl Harbor.
When the safety of the country is in peril, we may never know.
A famine. Oh, this is one of the weird stories, so bear with it.
The Great Kitchen at Windsor Castle is the oldest working kitchen in the country and has served 32 monarchs, including the late Queen Elizabeth II. On average, the kitchen has 33 members of staff, 20 chefs and sous chefs, 3 pastry chefs, and 10 porters. The clocks in the Great Kitchen are always set to be 5 minutes fast to ensure the food served to the monarch is never late. One of the most bizarre ghostly...
Hang on. Has Gordon Ramsay ever cooked in there? I want to know. Honestly, there's actually a episode of Hotel Hell where Gordon Ramsay is staying in a haunted new a haunted hotel in Connecticut, and one of the when he goes to take a shower, actually, he's like, I just hope that these ghosts aren't checking in on me.
Accounts took place in this very kitchen. Whilst washing his hands in the kitchen sink, a man who grew up as a child at the castle witnessed a man leading a horse across the kitchen and vanished into the wall.
That's got to be weird. Like, you've spent your whole life here. Cooking in this kitchen has been your job. You never expect to see this. That is weird.
A kitchen maid, who also witnessed the bizarre sight at the same time, recounted her experience to her family, but neither was believed when they described what they had seen. Years later, when the kitchen underwent significant repairs, a long-forgotten, hidden underground stable was discovered behind the very wall where the mysterious horse and groom vanished.
Oh, this is the one we also talked about. This one, this the self deletion, because I'm not sure, or if you can say this word.
The Long Walk is a 2.6-mile tree-lined avenue
I did end up
originally
saying
stretching
it.
from Windsor Castle to Snow Hill. According to legend, the high ground is where Henry VIII stood in wait to hear confirmation of the execution of Anne Boleyn. Charles
Howard couldn't even attend it.
II had double rows of elm trees planted along the path after the restoration.
Henry VIII did not even attend. Like, come on. Sorry, that's a bit of an off rant on Henry VIII.
In 1660. During Queen Anne's reign in 1710, a pathway through the trees was replaced by a more permanent road so coaches could smoothly arrive and depart from Windsor Castle. In 1927, overcome by feelings of grief and melancholy, a young guardsman.
Melancholy. That's where. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's more of a term used in the old country across the pond. I mean, I think it's still used. I think people still use it in the U.S. I don't know.
Aged 18, shot himself whilst on duty in the Long Walk.
But it's really interesting. I'm not really. It's really interesting. I'm intrigued to know why this kid supposedly shot himself. What was the reason? Because there's a lot of stories, these paranormal stories, where people just feel sudden, such sudden grief, and they just end themselves mysteriously. That's really weird.
Weeks later, Sergeant S. Leake took up post for a similar night vigil. Shortly after 2 a.m., he spotted a guardsman marching towards him. He was thankful that the soldier coming to relieve him of his duty had arrived early. Looking closely at the face of the man beneath his bearskin cap, he recognized the guardsman who had committed suicide only weeks earlier. Moments later, the apparition had mysteriously vanished. Hours later, a somewhat agitated guard came to finally relieve Sergeant Leake of his shift. When they discussed how the night shift had progressed, the other guardsman explained that he had had an identical experience. He'd also seen the same ghost, but at a different time. Once retired, Leake said that recalling the experience made the hair on the back of his neck stand on end.
This thing?
Alright. So let me get this second part 2 up, and we will go from there because there are other castles. There's also the Tower of London, which is haunted by a lot of people. And I know that's one of the places where they held Rudolf Hess after he crashed in Scotland in a, mm, you know, perhaps Rudolf Hess has some stories that you could find me a memoir. Sorry, I thought I heard something outside. Alright. But yeah, when you're at, go to Ghost Casebook and tell him I sent you here. Tell him Jared the American sent you here.
Windsor Castle is the oldest and largest inhabited castle in Europe. Construction began under William the Conqueror in the 11th century, and since that time...
Skip this part. Alright, this is also one of the stories we heard. The Eyes Right.
Another royal apparition witnessed at Windsor Castle is the figure of King George III.
And actually, there's a photo I want to get. Ghost in Scottish Castle. Because this this story reminded me of this one
who died
story about a ghost in a Scottish castle. Like, okay, some of these you can see double X. This one is extremely creepy. This one creeped me.
at Windsor Castle
This
at
one
the age of
photo that I have,
81.
I remember creeped me out.
It is well documented that King George III suffered from recurrent and eventually permanent mental illness. Some experts say that he may have been suffering from a liver disorder called porphyria, where toxic substances build up in the body, causing vomiting, confusion, fever, and an increased heart rate. Attacks of porphyria can last for days or even weeks, and when King George would suffer such an episode, he would be confined to a set of rooms below the Royal Library at Windsor Castle. These rooms overlooked the north terrace of the castle, and frequently the palace guards would march past and catch the eye of King George, temporarily bringing him back to normality. King George would stand at the window, observe the soldiers marching grandly past him, and he would raise his hand in acknowledgement of the guards' command of eyes right.
Yeah, not to get too political, but kind of reminds me of somebody. Kind of reminds me of somebody.
King George III,
Although I
eyes
do have to
right.
say he's got some drip here. King George III has some drip.
King George III died of pneumonia on the 29th of January, 1820. His body lay in state for 2 days, and his funeral and interment took place at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, on the 16th of February. Whilst his body lay in state, the routine changing of the guard continued as normal, and as the soldiers passed the king's old rooms, the chief guard, William Knowles, looked up and saw the familiar face of King George.
This reminds me of when. So back in 2016, a couple days after my grandfather had died, it was my grandpa had died on Yom Kippur of 2016, so it was a Wednesday. We held the funeral on Friday, and this was a Sunday. Me and my mom were actually going out to get a costume. Actually, that year, coincidentally, I wanted to dress as a red coat, but I ended up going as Connor from Assassin's Creed. Hey, because there's really no good red coat costumes. Maybe and maybe at some other point. But as I'm going to go outside to go to I look and I see the apparition of my grandpa sitting in the next, sitting next to my mom in the car. Well, I didn't know that my mom was in the car, and had texted her, "Hey, mom, are you in the car?" And she's like, "Yeah." And I never told her until weeks later that I had seen Grandpa's ghost sitting right next to her in the car.
Guards continued to follow their familiar command of eyes right, and in astonishment, the apparition of the king would make the customary gesture in return. Knowles went on to become the personal treasurer and financial manager of the Prince of Wales, who later became King Edward VII, a job he found difficult because of the prince's wild spending habits. In addition to King George being seen at the window below the Royal Library, his voice has been heard muttering, "What? What?" in deep confusion, sadly a very familiar phrase he was heard to say during those difficult times.
Honestly, like that state that King George was in reminds me so much of what I hear going on with Biden. I said I wouldn't get pickle, but just it's more of not political, but the medical state, the deteriorating state. I could do a whole separate video on this. I probably should do a whole separate video comparing the two.
times.
Charles the First.
In
Yes,
1642, the English Civil War broke out, splitting the country into royalists who supported King Charles I and parliamentarians, sometimes called Roundheads, who wished to abolish the monarchy. Windsor Castle fell to the parliamentarians, who quickly began looting St George's Chapel of its valuable artefacts. The chapel's organ, windows, and books were destroyed. The Lady Chapel and parts of Henry VIII's tomb were emptied of valuables, and by the end of the war, it is estimated that 100 kilos of gold and silver had been stolen. King Charles I was brought to the castle as a prisoner in 1647 before being moved to Hampton Court, then returned to Windsor for the last 3 weeks of his life before his trial and execution in January 1649. After his beheading, his body was brought back to Windsor.
What Charles II did when he came back, he pretty much avenged his father. Or it was just the Lion King. This is literally what English politics at that time were. It's just the Lion King. All right, if you think long and hard about it.
To be interred without ceremony in the vault of St George's Chapel. His coffin was draped with a black cloth and carried up to the chapel on the 8th of February 1649. Legend suggests the sky had been serene and clear until then, but suddenly clouded over, and a blizzard descended on Windsor Castle at that time. By the time the coffin reached the chapel, the black cloth was completely covered in white snow, with some suggesting that this was indeed a divine sign of his innocence. He was interred in the same vault as King Henry VIII and Jane Seymour. The spectre of Charles I is seen in the Canon's house, located in the castle grounds. Despite being beheaded, the apparition of the tragic king appears intact, with Charles looking sad and mournful, and looking exactly like the famous Van Dyck portrait he commissioned many years ago.
Honestly, if you want a good representation of what he probably would have looked like, just watch Cromwell 1970. Charles I is played by none other than the legendary Alec Guinness, who would go on to play Obi-Wan Kenobi. Who knows? Maybe we'll do a watch party. I'll get some my mutuals, my friends on Twitter, and we could just have a watch party.
You are the future.
Let me actually get that back up. Sorry.
The Norman Tower is also home to a ghostly figure of an unknown man. Used as a prison in the past, the man seems to be harmless. Children playing in the room have seen him, but never been frightened, and residents have felt an invisible entity brush past them. Perhaps this is the spirit of a prisoner who doesn't want to leave.
Ghostly policeman, 1970s.
In the 1970s, John Howden, a member of the Scots Guards, was stationed at Windsor Barracks. One Saturday in June, around 8 o'clock in the evening, he took up his duty within the private quarters of the castle, facing the gardens, well away from public access. This was a location with a reputation amongst the guardsmen of being haunted or unusual. Standing in his sentry box, he noticed the figure of a man approaching, a tall figure walking slowly, wearing a cape of some sort. He left his sentry box, raised his rifle and bayonet, and challenged the man to halt and explain who he was. The man greeted
This
the
is-
guard, and it became clear that he was in fact a policeman, wearing a police helmet, cape, and with his police badge on a chain on the cape itself.
And obviously, I'm very familiar with what they look like. Honestly, that's kind of a badass uniform. Why can't most British police dress like that today? Just dress up with. Oh yeah, I forgot. It's because they're more focused on being than tackling crime. Like if I saw a British police officer looking like Batman, I'd be like, I think I'd just stop what I was doing and freeze. Alright.
The policeman mentioned what a pleasant evening it was, and exclaimed that it had been a very long time since he had carried out that particular duty. Howden challenged the policeman as to whether he was authorised to be in this private area of the castle. The policeman assured Howden that this was indeed one of his regular patrols. Howden noticed the policeman wore his PC number on the collar of his tunic, which he thought was unusual, as present-day police officers wore theirs on their tunic shoulders. He now noticed that
How is this guy not able to see?
the whole uniform looked very old-fashioned, and was about to ask the policeman when he was interrupted by the officer asking if Howden would like a cigarette. Howden said no, but the policeman began to smoke. Howden exclaimed that perhaps he would see the policeman again. All of a sudden, the policeman said he had to go, mumbling good night, and disappeared very rapidly around the corner. Somewhat startled, Howden hurried to the corner to look for the police officer, but he had vanished. There was absolutely no sign of him. Puzzled, Howden returned to his duty. After his duty, he asked if any other guards had seen this mysterious policeman pass by on his way to the private quarters. None of them had. He reported the incident at the guard room, and it was officially logged. It was then explained to him that he had encountered the ghost of the policeman who died on duty of a heart attack 40 years ago in that particular area of the castle grounds. He had in fact been encountered by the guards many times.
Queen Victoria.
Windsor Castle was a very special place for Queen Victoria and her consort, Prince Albert. Queen Victoria also proposed to Albert in the Blue Closet, part of the private apartments. The night before her engagement, she wrote to her uncle Leopold, the King of Belgium, stating, "Albert's beauty is most striking, and he is, in short, very fascinating." After their wedding on the 10th of February 1840, the devoted couple chose Windsor Castle for their honeymoon. Victoria and Albert went on to have 9 children, all born at Buckingham Palace, with the exception of Prince Alfred, the future Duke of Edinburgh, who was born at Windsor in 1844.
I think that's around the time 1844 is actually the same year that Queen Victoria became the first British monarch to be photographed, actually.
5 of her children would marry at Windsor, 4 in St George's Chapel and 1 in the castle's own private chapel. In December 1861, at 10:50 p.m, Prince Albert died in the Blue Room at Windsor Castle when Victoria was only 42 years old. The Queen, completely stricken by grief, wore dark mourning clothes and became known as the Widow of Windsor. It took many years for Victoria to return to public life. Albert's body was temporarily entombed in St George's Chapel at Windsor. A year after his death, his remains were laid to rest at the Royal Mausoleum.
Honestly, this makes you sympathize a little bit. Just respond. Yeah.
Frogmore, in the grounds of Windsor Castle.
Yeah.
In March 1883, Victoria fell down some stairs at Windsor, which left her lame until July. She never fully recovered and was afflicted with rheumatism thereafter. In January 1901, Victoria, aged 81, complained of feeling weak and unwell. She died at Osborne House on the 22nd of January. On the 25th of January, her body was lifted into the coffin. She was dressed in her wedding veil and a white dress. A dressing gown belonging to Albert and a plaster cast of his hand were placed next to her. A lock of John Brown's hair and a picture of him were placed in her left hand, but were concealed from the family by a bunch of flowers. Her funeral took place at St. George's Chapel after 2 days of lying in state. She was interred next to her beloved Albert in the Royal Mausoleum at Frogmore.
Kind of poetic.
Victoria's great-grandson, Edward VIII, became king in 1936 after his father, George V, died at Sandringham. Although he was a king who was never crowned, Edward was impatient with royal protocol and caused concern amongst politicians due to his disregard for established conventions. As a young man, he had a reputation for being a womanizer and behaving recklessly, failing to settle down and having an array of affairs with married women. King George V was disappointed with his son and famously declared, "After I am dead, the boy will ruin himself in 12 months," a somewhat accurate prophecy.
What was George V cooking? By the way, I think one of Edward VIII's final words were, "I always knew Hitler was a good chap."
In 1930, Edward received the lease of Fort Belvedere in Windsor Castle, where he continued a series of relationships with married women, including Frida Dudley Ward and Lady Furness, who introduced Edward to fellow American divorcee Wallis Simpson. It became clear that Edward could not marry Simpson and remain on the throne, so Edward controversially abdicated.
At least, at least he's not as big. At least Edward VIII's not as big of a cuck as Harry.
With a reign of just 326 days, Edward's reign was one of the shortest in history. Edward VIII wanted to make some significant changes at Windsor. According to legend, Wallis Simpson wanted to remove some spruce trees planted by Victoria and Albert from the grounds of Windsor. This should have been a straightforward task. However, the work was hindered by a number of inexplicable phenomena. Apparently, the workers even witnessed the apparition of Queen Victoria herself, who appeared shouting and waving her arms in disapproval as she marched towards them.
God, that's gotta be menacing.
The trees still stand there today.
That reminds me, allegedly, I forgot which first lady it was. Now I've got to look it up. Lady. No. Go. House. Alright. See. Let's see. Actually, let's just finish this up because that reminds me of something. Alright. You know what? We're going to do a little bit into the White House. And maybe I should, at the end, share the whole story. Man, that is one of the weird. I'll save it for next week because we've already gone over an hour long. I think this has been a really good episode of the other kind. So we did some we only did Windsor Castle. Maybe next week we'll do the rest, but I kind of wanted to cover this story. Welcome to the mysterious world of the White House Rose Garden, a place steeped in beauty and perhaps even some ghostly mystery. Nestled in the heart of the White House grounds, this iconic garden has witnessed countless events. It has played host to some of the most influential figures in history, but besides its undeniable charm, there are whispers of paranormal activity that have sparkle and aura of mystique over this iconic location. The White House Rose Garden is known for its exquisite display of flowers and its roses as a backdrop for important political announcements and ceremonies, has a rich and storied history that dates back to the early years of the United States. It has meticulously cultivated and evolved over time, shaped by the vision and taste of various first ladies who have called the White House home. From its ever enchanting beauty of delicate roses to enthralling stories that surround it, the White House Rose Garden is undoubtedly intriguing an intriguing destination for both history enthusiasts and paranormal enthusiasts alike. Join us as we explore legend stories, and alleged hauntings that have become intertwined with this renowned garden. All right, I'm ah Ellen Wilson, the wife of President Woodrow Wilson, played a significant role in the creation of the modern Rose Garden. So Charles F. Let's see. Her, let's see. The legend and um, it's of Dolly Mass. Another ghost here that is said to haunt the Rose Garden is that of Dolly Madison, the wife of President James Madison. Dolly was a vibrant and influential First Lady, and her presence is still felt in the White House to this day. Some claim to have witnessed a ghost lady in a flowing believed to be Dolly walking through the Rose Garden, tending to flowers with great care. Where is it? There's uh the ghost of Dolly Mass, because let's see, we've got Link and first, let's see, because there was one of the first ladies. Hang on, ghost of Dolly Mass, because there was a story. All right. Hmm. All right. Here it is. As we begin to close out, because this has gone on for a while. The White House is known as Washington's most haunted building. No wonder it, considering the tumultuous times that our president and their families have endured while living there. Many historians credit Dolly Madison with establishing the first rose garden on the mighty grounds of the president's house. As it was known, when Woodrow Wilson's wife Edith asked two employees to transfer the garden to another location, the angry ghost of Dolly Madison appeared to them. As a result, you know, Jane Madison should have just appeared to Woodrow Wilson, been like, "You're stop screwing up the country." As a result, the Rose Garden remained its in its original location to this day. The idyllic. So, just some food for thought. Uh, I think that's where we're gonna end at. We've been going for over an hour. I think we did a good job. I'll cover some more sightings next week. How about that? I'll go into some more ghost sightings in other castles next week. Heck, maybe I could. I'll put a poll actually. The that will. I'll put a poll in the to say, hey, what do you want me to cover next week? I'll have several options. But without thank like this video, comment, share, subscribe, and I will see you later.
Ladies and gentlemen, our national anthem.